From the March 2023 coordinators meeting, use of crisis funds. The point behind this presentation is to actually avert our own crisis. So the first thing I want to do is go through some words that are commonly found not only in our guidelines, but in federal regulation, statute, and other things. Understanding what are commonly used words in the context of policy, regulation, or statute is one of the reasons why sometimes we don't make the best decisions or we don't understand the implications of what it is we're reading. So that first word we're going to take a look at, and it seems pretty straightforward, shall, and that is a mandatory action. Expresses intent or determination. The agency shall do this, ... so on down the line. When we look at the word may as a verb, it indicates choice. It's a passive word, and so it does imply that it is not required. Shall is mandatory, it is required. May, depending on how it fits in the sentence, implies that you have a certain decision-making authority. The inverse of those, shall not, mandatory language again, and means that you're not allowed. May not, again, is that passive and indicates that there is potentially some level of choice or decision that you would need to make. The language above or below that probably gives you the scope or the context of your authority to make that decision as well. Will, again, that is another mandatory phrase. It's pretty much the same as shall. And then you have should, another kind of passive thing. It does seem to indicate a choice typically when you find it. And, when I look at this, I see, and I tend to try to use this in my policy writing as that it's not 100% required, but it's strongly implying that it is followed. Think of it as a short way of saying this is a best practice or this is my advice to you. Then again, the opposite of those, will not and should not, again, not allowed, mandatory. And again, should not is that, you get to make a decision, but we'd really suggest you probably don't do this unless there's some specific circumstances surrounding that. Then we get into and or for you fans of the old Schoolhouse Rock. There was the video Conjunction Junction, and that's what both of these words are. And when you look at it, and that's linking words or phrases, and it will mean that everything is all inclusive. It's connected. So when it says the agencies shall do comprehensive monitoring or shall do a quality control inspection on every job and require the client to sign off indicating they're satisfied with the work. Those are examples of how that and means you get to do both parts or you have to do both parts. It connects things together. When you look at that with some of those passive terms where you think you have a choice of may or should, and those words and still show up in there, it still combines it. You don't get to go a la carte and go, oh, I would like to do this, but I don't want to do that. If that word and is in there and the agency may do this and that, well, it means those are passive and they're connected. They're linked together. When the word or is used, there is that choice or option factor. So the agency may do this or that. Now you get to choose between one or the other. When and is used, it's a connection. It locks the two together. It binds them. Or when it's used in a series, where you have 2, 3, or 4 things listed off, they're all combined. You own everything that comes with that. So understanding how these words fit, not just in the term of crisis, which is what we're talking about in this video, but in anything with the guidelines, it's understanding what those words really mean. They're words you use every day and you think you know what they mean, but when you start looking at policy, regulation, and statute, there's a more binding factor to what those documents mean to you. And so understanding that has a big difference on what you actually do. We're now going to take a look at a section of the crisis policy and the guidelines. So 31A7, this is what the language has said for a very, very long time, probably pretty much since there's been crisis funds and weatherization. And it does indicate that the primary use for these funds are for the heating season. Fundamentally, the reason crisis funds exist, because we are a heating climate, is that we want to make sure that grandma never freezes to death, right? And so that is what the case is. Over time, there have been expansion of allowable activities of crisis work in this program, and this specific provision has never changed, but there was just understanding. It was explained to me by the predecessors of this program that ran it, and it was understood by your predecessors at your local agencies. But unfortunately, that was a kind of an institutional knowledge thing that went away when people went away. So it's time to go in and visit this. You can see there's in the red, those are edits that are going to take place for program year 23 to this section. It is not a change of policy. It is a it's a clarification of the existing policy so that everybody is now on the same page in writing for how you should be applying your crisis funds. Further revision and clarification of this section is going to indicate these 2 bullets down here in red, also kind of that red line language you see. And it puts that responsibility more clearly stated that you as an agency, as a subgrantee, have the responsibility to monitor your expenditures and adjust your services as your funding dictates. I cannot be there to manage your contracts for you. That is not the state's responsibility. We give you that responsibility. You've had it. And this is going to clear that up. Pay special attention to the second bullet. While we empower you to make these decisions based upon your budget that you're managing, you do need to be in consultation with us. And simply put, it is mandatory. Before you make that move, you notify us and you consult with us. And together, we will determine if that is necessary and what that looks like. When making these decisions, if you just simply tell me you're going to drop water heaters, I'm going to respond with no. You're going to have to show me information and data on how you've derived this decision and how long you think the suspension of these activities will last. It's not going to be an open-ended decision for you to modify fundamentally how the program operates. You would have that ability to modify it short-term based upon your budgetary constraints. When we start talking about things like this, here are 2 words that will better help put what we're going to look at next in context. The first one is hierarchy. And again, that is that organization ranking, right? Or organized ranking of importance. And the second one, this is a term, load shedding. It's a term associated with power generation, electrical generation specifically. When you start reaching too much demand, if the power plant cannot produce the amount of electricity that the grid is demanding, if they do not shed load, which is a fancy way of saying a blackout, then the entire grid fails. And so they start dropping substations offline to get the demand to meet the supply. And that is why this is apropos in this situation. If the demand on your funds to deliver crisis service call work is exceeding your supply, then you need to shed some load. And there is a hierarchy or an order of level of importance to how you're going to go about doing that. So when we take a look at this chart, or graphic, I guess, it's not really a chart, the most important thing, as the guidelines state, is always making sure we provide heating crisis. And the lowest on that far right, something that probably sometimes comes in very handy, and there's times that maybe it gets a bit overused, is other crisis additional service. Pay special attention to this order. Don't think you start with water heaters and get to still have your cake and eat it too and do agency identified work under provisions of crisis. There is a hierarchy and an order to how this gets done. And inside each one of these individual categories, other, water heater, cooling, and so on down the line, there is another hierarchy to how you shed this load. So obviously that first one, if you feel the hit on your budget is too high, then you probably need to stop putting agency identified work into worst case draft, reading what's on the screen instead of what I need to be saying. You need to start with shedding agency identified work. That means you stop using crisis service call funding to put in windows and doors as part of weatherization. That means you stop using crisis funds to replace knob and tube as part of weatherization. That's where you would tap into your weatherization readiness money, for example. Likewise, inside water heater crisis, as you see on the graphic, that replacing of a water heater identified by the agency is failing worst case draft. Those things that you're doing, you're dipping into your crisis dollars while you're out there doing weatherization activities. You're expanding the scope of weatherization and using crisis funds to pay for it. And there are times that is to the program and your agency's advantage. And that is why it's allowable and put in policy that way. But if you start feeling the pinch on your crisis budget, then you need to start making sure you're putting those expenses over in the health and safety budget of weatherization and cover it there. The next step down would be replacing the water heater. Instead of replacing it, you go to repairs, if possible. But you'll notice that next step down is in direct response to an application from a client. Not you, your staff, going out for an entirely different reason and saying, oh, we need to fix your water heater too while we're here. So you're only responding to specific requests via application from a client. And that's where you would shed that load. Eventually you get to the point where you make the decision you need to get out of the water heater crisis business completely. You don't get to have your cake and eat it too. You're not going to stop serving clients with water heater crisis problems and still dip into your bag of tricks and use crisis money to supplement your behavior over weatherization. That next box, cooling. Same scenarios. You start replacing systems. Right now, there's times you make those decisions that it's just best to go ahead and replace it. And while you're at it, let's just put in air conditioning with it too, because of compatibility issues and all these other things. Well, now it's time to stop replacing furnaces if there's nothing wrong with the furnace. You fix the air conditioning problem, replace components of air conditioning, but you leave the furnace alone. If there's nothing wrong with it, then you don't go in and you replace the furnace as part of the cooling crisis. And likewise, it wasn't on the graphic here, but that also means installation of new systems. There was an AC and you start deciding that there needs to be AC, or the client asks you for new AC. Well, that's where you start shedding that load. System replacements. You reach a point where you can't afford to replace, well, then you go back to repair only. You reach a point where you can't even afford to repair cooling, then again, you stop doing cooling crisis altogether. And then that last box, we're getting to the point where we're getting to what I said in the meeting, the Alamo, that last line of defense. We start with dropping off including ACs. Just like I said on the prior slide, when you're out there doing air conditioning cooling crisis, or a cooling crisis, you don't replace the furnace. It goes the same way. You're out there on a heating crisis, you don't replace the air conditioning. You don't let your contractor talk you into replacing the air conditioning. You don't let the client. You say, we've restored heat, and that's when you're done. Likewise, you get to that point where you stop replacing systems and you just go down to repair as well. So everything has its hierarchy. As the demand on your budget starts exceeding its capacity, you keep shedding load. You finally get down that last line of defense. The Alamo is if your budget was so low that you're only going to repair heating systems so that you can keep people warm. Now, put this in a bigger context and understand the policy that we looked at the very beginning of this. When you start making these decisions, and every time you make one of these decisions to shed load, according to the hierarchy, you're going to be in consultation with the state. That means we're going to be aware, and when possible, we're going to do what we can to get more funding if it's available. But that's not a promise. We can't promise and guarantee money in the future because, as you know, we have no way of knowing what funds will be available except from year to year. This is why it is up to you to responsibly manage your funding. And the things that I have been seeing in the last few years, we've had these years where we've been very flush with crisis dollars. In some cases, there's some agencies that have accumulated very large balances. And there was guidance that everybody needed to work those balances down. Ideally, you would have, at the beginning of a program year, no more than 18 months worth of crisis funding on the books over your multiple contracts. Bare minimum would be that you have 12 months of crisis funding at the beginning of a program year. But we don't want you accumulating balances. That's been a problem, having all this extra money on the books. But we do want to make sure you have enough out there. In some cases, some of you, as you've spent down those excessive balances, you have not recalibrated your behavior to start going back and living within your means. You started dragging more and more work over from agency identified work, from weatherization activities and other stuff, which again, we have designed and built that into policy to give you that flexibility. But once you get back in that operating window where you need to be within your budget, you have to control your behavior. And that is why that box is the lowest priority, or was back over to the far right, because that is what's really been putting the largest amount of drain on there. And in some cases, some of you are even blanket charging FTE, labor and fringe, over into your crisis in some cases as part of your spending strategy as well. So you need to look at all the components that are going into the expenses being charged to your crisis budget and figure out, based upon this guidance in this video, how to make the necessary adjustments so that you can survive and not have your own crisis. Like always, when you have questions, please come to the state with them and we can work together to try to solve them before they become too big of a problem. Calling us up at the last minute and telling us you're out of money, that doesn't give us a chance to do anything to help you. So please manage your budgets wisely. Thanks.